The ballroom was silent. Crystal chandeliers glowed above. Every eye turned to him. The American CEO stood frozen. The French investors were waiting. Contracts worth millions on the table. But the translator never showed up. The investors whispered in French. The CEO didn't understand a word. He tried to laugh it off, but panic was setting in. He needed a miracle fast. That's when the janitor entered. His teenage daughter walked beside him. She held her school books tightly. Nobody noticed her at first, but she noticed everything. The French conversation, the tension in the room. Then she spoke. Flawless French, confident and clear. The investor's head snapped toward her. The CEO blinked in shock. The janitor froze mid-step. His daughter kept talking, translating every word perfectly. Calm, composed, commanding respect. The room shifted instantly, and in that moment, the power dynamic changed forever. The boardroom felt heavier than the polished oak table. Mr. Grayson, the CEO, was pacing like a storm. Sweat collected at his temples. Every executive avoided eye contact. Across the table, 3 French investors sat patiently. They exchanged quiet whispers, occasionally raising curious brows. Their folders remained unopened, their pens untouched, waiting. "Where is the translator?" Grayson barked, slamming his palm. A few papers fluttered nervously. The assistant stammered, "She canceled. Her flight got delayed, sir." The CEO froze, eyes narrowing. "No translator? No backup plan? This is a multi-million-dollar meeting." His voice echoed like thunder. Silence spread through the room. Every executive shifted uncomfortably, their polished shoes squeaking faintly. The investors leaned back, unimpressed. One of them muttered in French a phrase no one understood. Except, from the back corner, a quiet chair scraped backward. Everyone turned to see her. The janitor's daughter, Emily, who had been waiting silently. Her father worked maintenance upstairs, and she sometimes accompanied him, reading books while he cleaned. She stood nervously but straight. I can translate, sir," she said, voice steadying slightly. The room froze in disbelief. Grayson blinked, stunned and irritated. Executives exchanged doubtful glances instantly. "Translate? You?" Grayson scoffed. "This isn't a high school essay. This is international finance, girl." But Emily didn't flinch. Her hands tightened at her side. She glanced toward the investors confidently. Then, in perfect fluent French, she introduced herself with composure. The Frenchmen looked surprised. Their stiff expressions softened slightly. They responded in flowing French, testing her with sharp phrasing. The executives leaned forward, shocked. Even the assistant's jaw dropped. For the first time, silence fell not from panic, but awe. Mr. Grayson's face darkened instantly. He wasn't relieved, not yet. If anything, he looked threatened. His authority, his control, his image, a janitor's daughter was rescuing him. He plastered on a forced smile. "Well then," he said stiffly, gesturing toward the empty chair. "Let's see if you're as good as you think you are." Emily walked forward, heart racing. Her father's old advice rang, "Never lower your eyes, Emily. Words have power, use them." She pulled the chair back, sat between CEO and investors, and waited for the storm, because this was only beginning. The ballroom had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. Dozens of international guests shifted in their seats, checking their phones or whispering among themselves. Every tick of the giant crystal chandelier clock above the stage made the tension worse. Mr. Coleman, the CEO, stood there red-faced, clutching his cue cards that were useless without a translator. His hands trembled ever so slightly, and that tremble didn't go unnoticed by the reporters in the back row. Near the back of the room, where hotel staff usually stayed out of sight, a janitor named Luis froze mid-mop. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this event, only cleaning the hallway outside, but curiosity had drawn him close. And with him, quietly waiting, was his daughter Isabella, just 16. Isabella wasn't supposed to be here either. She had begged to come with her father because she loved the way the hotel lit up for events. To her, it felt like stepping into another world. One where people wore tailored suits, sparkling dresses, and spoke in different languages. But now, seeing the panic on stage, she leaned closer to her dad. "Papa," she whispered. "He's struggling because no one can translate French." Luis blinked, torn between duty and concern. He whispered back, "I know, mija. I didn't know you spoke French," he finally said, his voice carrying a mix of shock and disbelief. Lily flushed slightly. I don't usually mention it, but the French executives weren't giving her a moment to downplay herself. "Finally, someone who respects our language," one of them said warmly, this time in English. He added with a smile, "And someone who understands us better than your so-called translators." The words hit hard. Everyone glanced nervously at the empty translator chair, the one that had failed them earlier. Mr. Carmichael leaned forward. "So, you're telling me the janitor's daughter just saved a multi-million-dollar deal?" Lily's father, standing humbly at the edge of the room with his mop bucket, lowered his head. He looked like he wanted to disappear, but one of the French executives suddenly stood and extended his hand. Not to Mr. Carmichael, not to the board, but to Lily. "Mademoiselle," he said with a grin, "perhaps you should be the one negotiating." The room erupted in whispers. A janitor's daughter negotiating with billionaires? It sounded insane. But after what they had just witnessed, it didn't sound impossible. Mr. Carmichael's eyes narrowed. He was a man who prided himself on control. Losing the meeting earlier had rattled him, but regaining it through her, someone so far below the corporate ladder, made his ego sting. Still, he knew what mattered most, saving face and closing the deal. He gestured to Lily. "All right, Miss Lily," she said softly. "All right, Miss Lily," he continued, his tone sharper now. "You're here. You've shown us you can translate. Now prove to us that wasn't just luck. Sit down." He pointed to the vacant chair at the table. The one meant for high-level executives. The one she had no right to be in. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. Her father shook his head slightly from across the room, silently warning her not to get involved. But the French executives were watching her with eager eyes, clearly trusting her more than anyone else in the room. Slowly, with trembling hands, Lily pulled out the chair. She sat down at the massive polished table, surrounded by millionaires and power players. The janitor's daughter, suddenly holding the fate of an entire international deal in her hands. And in that moment, Lily realized something terrifying and thrilling at once. She wasn't just translating anymore. She was about to negotiate. The conference room felt like the center of the universe. Reporters were packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras blinking, pens scribbling, voices buzzing in multiple languages. For Richard, the CEO, it was supposed to be his crowning moment, the day he cemented his global expansion deal with the French partners. But the silence that had followed his failed attempts to speak French still hung heavy in the air. Only now that silence had been broken by her. Isabella, the janitor's daughter, stood tall, her voice steady as she translated every word back and forth. English to French, French to English, with such fluidity that everyone in the room leaned in closer, hanging on her words. Her accent was flawless, her tone respectful yet authoritative, and her ability to capture even the tiniest nuance made both sides smile with relief. The French executives, who had moments earlier exchanged worried looks, now leaned back comfortably, nodding in approval. One of them even whispered to another, "C'est magnifique. She's better than our hired interpreters." Richard watched in awe. The same girl he had once overlooked in the hallway, thinking of her as just the janitor's kid, was saving his reputation in front of an international audience. His palms were sweaty, his heart racing. The thought of what would have happened if she hadn't stepped up made his stomach turn. He had nearly lost the deal before it began. But Isabella wasn't just translating, she was negotiating. When one of the French executives raised a concern about cultural misalignment, Isabella didn't just repeat the words. She explained, adjusted, and softened the phrasing to make it more palatable. She knew when to emphasize, when to pause, when to lean into humor to ease the tension, and the audience noticed. Journalists shifted their cameras toward her, scribbling notes. Some were no longer writing about the CEO's deal, but about the young woman who had taken control of the stage without ever being invited. Richard felt the power shift tangibly. The meeting was no longer about him, it was about her. He forced a smile, trying to mask his panic. But inside, the CEO in him was screaming, "This girl could ruin me. Or save me. And I have no control over which it will be." As the meeting progressed, Isabella's confidence grew. Her hands moved naturally with her words, her posture straightened, her eyes brightened. She didn't look like a janitor's daughter anymore. She looked like someone born to command respect. And when the French chairman finally leaned across the table, smiling warmly at her, he said something that made Richard's heart nearly stop. "She should be leading these talks, not you." The room broke into murmurs, cameras clicking faster, reporters buzzing with excitement. Richard swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, the spotlight wasn't his. It belonged entirely to Isabella, and he didn't know whether to feel grateful or terrified. The room, once filled with the heavy tension of failure, now brimmed with energy. Sophie sat at the head of the long oak table, posture steady, eyes fixed on both the CEO and the French partners. For the first time that day, the two sides weren't talking at each other. They were communicating through her. Her French was fluid, almost melodic, carrying across the room with confidence. She wasn't just translating word for word anymore. No, she was interpreting tone, smoothing over misunderstandings, and adjusting phrasing so that both cultures felt respected. It was a skill that went far beyond language. It was empathy wrapped in diplomacy. The French executives leaned in, smiling more with each exchange. They gestured animatedly, clearly impressed not just with the clarity but with how Sophie made them feel understood. Across the table, Richard, the CEO, sat with his jaw slightly slack, his eyes flicking between Sophie and the men he had once thought were lost causes. His assistant kept glancing nervously at him as if to say, "How did we miss this?" When the French CFO cracked a light joke, something that could have easily gotten lost in translation, Sophie delivered it in perfect English, even mimicking his playful tone. The entire room erupted into laughter. What had started as a potential disaster was now transforming into a breakthrough. Richard cleared his throat, finally regaining his composure. "Well, I suppose introductions are in order," he said, his voice oddly restrained. He looked at Sophie. "Would you care to tell us who you are exactly?" Sophie hesitated. She hadn't expected to get this far. Everyone in the room turned to her, waiting. For a moment, she considered brushing it off, keeping her father's job safe by staying in the shadows. But then she thought of him, the janitor, quietly working late nights, ignored by men like Richard. No one had ever asked his name during board meetings. She straightened her shoulders. "My name is Sophie Alvarez," she said clearly, her voice echoing. "I'm not an employee here. My father is." There was a murmur across the table. The French partners looked intrigued. Richard blinked, taken aback. "Your father?" he repeated. "Yes," Sophie confirmed. "He's been the janitor here for nearly 10 years. He taught me to never waste knowledge, even if people don't think you'll ever need it. That's why I studied languages. That's why I'm here." Silence hung in the air. It was the kind of silence where the truth cuts deeper than any insult. The French CEO finally leaned forward, speaking softly in French. Sophie translated smoothly. "Your company should be proud. Talent doesn't always wear a suit." Richard froze. His cheeks flushed as realization hit. This young woman, the janitor's daughter, had just saved him millions, if not his entire reputation. And yet he had overlooked her completely. But Sophie wasn't done yet. She met his gaze directly and said, "With all due respect, Mr. Hale, I think it's time you start recognizing value where it truly lies." The French executives nodded approvingly. And in that instant, the balance of power in the room shifted. The room shifted in atmosphere. What began as a potential disaster for Mr. Callahan had turned into a masterclass of control, all thanks to a girl no one had noticed before. For the first time that day, the French investors looked genuinely at ease. Their arms were no longer crossed, their smiles no longer forced. They leaned forward, asking questions directly, this time to Emily. Mr. Callahan, still struggling to balance his authority and his pride, attempted to steer the meeting back into his hands. "Thank you, Emily," he said in a voice that trembled slightly. "But perhaps we should continue." But before he could finish, the lead investor, Monsieur Dupont, raised a hand politely. "No, Mr. Callahan, we would prefer to hear from her. She seems to understand not just our words, but our meaning." That single sentence landed like a thunderclap. Callahan's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being overshadowed, especially not by the daughter of a janitor. He gave a rehearsed smile, but his eyes betrayed frustration. Still, he had no choice. "Of course," he muttered. She whispered to herself, "This is my chance." The CEO, however, wasn't about to let go so easily. "Wait just a minute," Colin said sharply. "She's not an employee, she's not authorized. This company deals through me." His voice shook slightly as he spoke, but Jacques only smiled faintly and replied in English this time. "Then perhaps your company has the wrong representative." The words landed like thunder. Emily suddenly understood. This was no longer about translation, it was about leadership, and she was standing on the edge of something life-changing. The boardroom had turned silent again. Mr. Harrison sat back in his chair, visibly shaken by the events of the last hour. He had entered this meeting with the French investors fully confident that his polished image and sharp suits were all he needed to maintain power. But today, power had shifted. The girl who had been invisible just yesterday, Maya, the janitor's daughter, was now the center of attention. Her calm yet powerful command of French had saved the deal from falling apart. She wasn't just translating words, she was shaping the tone, adjusting the energy in the room and turning hostility into trust. Harrison finally broke the silence. "Miss Maya," he said, his voice lower, almost cautious. "Would you mind staying after the meeting? I think we need to discuss something." Everyone's eyes shifted to him. This was the same man who had openly dismissed her father as nothing more than a janitor. The same man who nearly humiliated the company by not arranging a translator. And now he was asking for her time. Maya nodded politely. "Of course, sir." The French investors leaned back, clearly impressed. One of them, a man named Mr. Fournier, smiled warmly. "You have quite a hidden gem here," he said in accented English. "She has not only translated but guided this discussion in a way that benefits both sides. We are prepared to move forward because of her." It was the ultimate praise, the kind that CEOs craved, and yet it wasn't directed at Harrison. It was directed at the janitor's daughter. After the investors left, Harrison loosened his tie, still processing what had just happened. He gestured for Maya to follow him into his office. "Maya," he began, pacing the room, "you realize what you did today was extraordinary. You didn't just translate. You represented this company better than some of my own executives." Maya stayed composed, though inside her heart was racing. She had spent years studying languages, practicing late into the night. But she had never imagined those skills would matter here, in this building where she was invisible. "I only did what was necessary, sir," she said. Harrison stopped pacing. For once, he looked vulnerable. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "If this deal had collapsed, I would have been finished. My board is already questioning me. You may have just saved my career." It was a startling admission, especially from a man who prided himself on control. Then came the moment Maya didn't expect. "I'd like to officially bring you on," Harrison said. "Not as an intern, not as an assistant. I want you on the executive communication team. You'll be compensated fairly, of course. But more than that, you'll have a seat at the table." Her breath caught. Was this real? Was he actually offering her a role that people with Ivy League degrees would fight for? But before she could answer, Maya thought of her father. The man who had worked thankless night shifts cleaning this very building. The man who had been mocked, dismissed, and underestimated. And now his daughter was being handed the opportunity of a lifetime. The tables had turned. Maya smiled slightly. "I'll consider it, sir, but I'll have conditions." For the first time all day, it wasn't Harrison in control of the room, it was her. The room fell into a heavy silence. Everyone stared at Emily as if she had just turned the entire meeting upside down. The French executives whispered among themselves, clearly impressed with her flawless translation and confident demeanor. The CEO, however, was visibly shaken. His face had gone pale, his eyes darting between Emily, the board members, and the French investors. For the first time that day, the arrogant confidence he had been wearing like armor began to crack. One of the French executives leaned forward, speaking directly to Emily. "Mademoiselle, your French is impeccable. How did you learn?" Emily smiled politely. "My father is Algerian. I grew up speaking both Arabic and French at home, and English at school. Languages were a natural part of my life." Gasps echoed around the room. The same daughter of the janitor, the same girl who had been dismissed moments ago as unimportant, was now the reason the deal was still alive. The investors exchanged glances, then one of them turned to the CEO and said, "You are fortunate to have someone like her. Your company does not seem prepared for global partnerships." The CEO's jaw tightened. He forced a smile, trying to salvage his pride. "Yes, of course, Emily has been helpful." But the board members weren't fooled. They had all seen the panic in his eyes, the way Emily had swooped in and saved the company's reputation. Several of them were already whispering about how reckless it had been for him to ignore something as essential as a translator for such a high-stakes deal. He wasn't smiling, but his chest swelled with quiet pride. For years he had been overlooked, treated as invisible, yet his daughter had just proven that brilliance doesn't always wear a suit. Emily glanced at him briefly, her eyes softening. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She wasn't doing it to embarrass the CEO. She was doing it because she refused to let ignorance and arrogance destroy an opportunity for so many hardworking employees who depended on this company for their livelihood. Then one of the board members, an older woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Emily," she said firmly, "we need you to stay for the remainder of these negotiations. You've earned your seat at this table." The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His control of the situation was slipping, and everyone knew it. But before he could object, the French executives nodded in agreement. "We," one of them said. "We would prefer it if Mademoiselle Emily led the translation. She is clear, precise, and trustworthy." The CEO had no choice but to agree. His empire, his pride, was now in the hands of the janitor's daughter. And Emily. She sat taller, her voice steady as she translated the next proposal, proving once again that knowledge and humility could outshine arrogance every single time. The boardroom fell silent. Every executive sat frozen, their eyes darting between the French investors, Mr. Collins and Sophia, the janitor's daughter who had just changed the course of the company's future. The French delegation began to applaud. At first it was polite, but then it grew louder, echoing off the tall glass walls. One of them even stood and said in accented English, "This girl saved your company today." Mr. Collins swallowed hard. He had spent years building his reputation as a powerhouse CEO, but never had he felt so exposed. His panic, his weakness, it had all been laid bare in front of the investors. And yet it was Sophia who carried them through with poise, intelligence, and courage. He forced a smile. "Thank you, Sophia." I don't know what to say." Sophia turned to him, calm but firm. "You should say thank you to my father too. He raised me to believe that no job is too small and no voice should be ignored." The janitor, standing awkwardly near the door with his mop still in hand, lowered his eyes. But the investors turned toward him, nodding with respect. For the first time in his life, the quiet man who cleaned their offices every night was recognized not as invisible, but as the father of the girl who just saved a multi-million-dollar deal. One of the French investors leaned in and whispered something to Sophia in French. She listened, then translated aloud, her voice steady. "They say they would like to see me continue as the lead translator for all future negotiations." Gasps filled the room. Executives whispered to each other in disbelief. The janitor's daughter, a teenager who wasn't even on the payroll, was being given responsibility beyond their wildest imagination. Mr. Collins's jaw tightened. He realized that if he refused, the investors might walk away. He nodded reluctantly. Then it settled. "Sophia, welcome to the team." The room erupted again, but this time with cautious admiration. The executives scribbled notes, already picturing the headlines. CEO saved by janitor's daughter. Later that evening, Sophia walked out of the glass tower with her father. The sun was setting, painting the city in warm orange light. He looked at her with tears in his eyes. "I never wanted you to feel like your place was only in the shadows," he said softly. "Today you proved you belong in the light." Sophia smiled, holding his hand. "And you taught me to never forget where I come from." Behind them, the massive skyscraper loomed, filled with power and wealth. But tonight, it wasn't the CEO or the executives who were remembered. It was the janitor's daughter, the girl who stepped forward when no one else could. And for the first time, both father and daughter walked away knowing that the world finally saw them. Not as less, not as invisible, but as exactly who they were meant to be.